Catalonia is a region in the northeast of Spain. Although it's in Spain, it has a very strong regional identity and history with their own language as well. And this in recent years has led to some saying that Catalonia actually should be its own country outside of Spain and completely autonomous. To this end, in 2017, the Catalan government organised an in-out referendum on Catalan independence and declared that with 92% voting in favour of secession, that Catalunya would become its own country. However, before the vote had even taken place, the Spanish government said that it was unconstitutional and illegal and would therefore be non-binding, and Catalonia remained a part of Spain. A few weeks ago, in 2021, the arrest of the Spanish rapper Pablo Hastél, known in Catalan as Pau Rivadulya Duro, sparked controversy as he had been arrested because he'd praised several terrorist groups from Spain like the ETA, which were the Euskadi Ta Askatasuna, which was the Basque separatist group that wanted to see the Basque country become an independent country, as well as another one called GRAPO, which was a Marxist group active largely in the 70s, standing for the Grupos de Resistencia Antifascista Primero de Octubre, which also resulted in the deaths of several Spaniards. And that was one of the reasons he was arrested. But more controversially, it was because of tweets he had sent that were offensive to the royal family. They were offending the king and other members of the royalty, which in Spain is a crime. Since then, people across Spain have taken to the streets in protest, these protests being especially strong in his native Catalonia. With the Catalan regional elections earlier this month showing a large increase in support for pro-independence parties in the regional government, I thought this would be a very interesting time to have a look at what's behind these demonstrations and why there is this independence movement inside Catalunya, and if there is indeed a historical basis to it, as well as tying it into this rapper and the recent events. I have covered this video before, about 4 years ago, when everything was kicking off with this independence referendum in Catalunya, but I wasn't too happy with that video. I made a few errors and I don't think I was as balanced as I might have been, so I hope that this video will be a better guide to the history of this complex situation, because there are many different versions of this history going on as it's become incredibly politicized in the modern climate for people who either support independence or do not support independence. And so this video in some ways will be looking at these claims and looking at the actual history of Catalunya as a whole as part of Spain and whether or not it had broken off and tried to be independent in the past. I think a good place to start is with the Roman invasion of the Iberian Peninsula, because this brought the language of Latin, and I think language is an important aspect when looking at the Catalan culture and identity, because part of that argument rests on the fact that they see themselves as being intrinsically very different to the rest of Spain and having their own identity, which a lot of the time is tied into language. But just a quick caveat is to say that not every Catalan speaker is an avid independence supporter, and there are lots of people who speak Catalan that wish to remain with Spain, and there are also people who speak Catalan in the neighbouring region of Valencia who do want to remain with Spain as well. So it's not just inside the province of Catalonia today. That's important, but I think that language and this different evolution of Spanish and Catalan is important to look at, because they are both Western Romance languages. But if we actually look into the language trees, Spanish sits in a different branch, that is the Ibero-Romance branch, with languages like Galician and Portuguese, whereas Catalan sits in the Gallo-Romance branch, with French being a more distant relation, and Catalan is most closely related to the Occitan language spoken in the south of France and in parts of Spain as well, the Val d'Aran in Catalunya itself. Around 800 is the date given to the separation when we can start to talk about an old Catalan language as opposed to just a vulgar Latin language itself. Now, this came a little after the Muslim invasion of the Iberian Peninsula in 711, displacing the old Germanic Visigothic kingdom that had come in after the Romans, and instead starting a period of Muslim rule in large parts of Spain. Now, the neighbours to the west of the old Visigothic kingdoms were the Franks, and they weren't too happy with their new neighbours as they had raided them before, and so they set up what became known as Marcher Lords, this word march meaning border, and these lords, they went on the offensive and started to capture areas in what's now Catalonia from the Muslims and created their own little counties on the periphery of the Frankish Empire. And one of these was the county of Barcelona. And this county was also matched in the very north of Spain, so a different entity that rebelled against the Muslim rule there in Asturias. And these two together would form the backbone of the Christian reconquest, la reconquista, of the lands that had been captured by the Muslims. So one from the very north of Spain in Asturias, and now also these Frankish-backed marcher lords in the region of what's now Catalonia and slightly further north as well. Now, this kingdom of Asturias would eventually become the kingdom of León, while the county of Barcelona would marry into the kingdom of Aragon, another one of these kingdoms in Spain, to form the crown of Aragon, although they would retain certain privileges whilst being within that. And this is a key topic for looking at the independence of Catalunya, because many of the Catalan separatists support the idea that this kingdom of Aragon and the special privileges held by the region of Catalonia within that is evidence for the fact that they had been independent, whereas many on the other side, some might call them the Spanish nationalists or the unionists, would say that actually no, Spain is a mixture of these various kingdoms, that is not an independent Catalan kingdom. You were part of the kingdom of Aragon and not a separate one, so that does not count as a historical basis for independence as a different people. The first time we hear about Catalans as a separate group is in a manuscript dated to around 1120. It's called the Liber Maioliginus de Gestis Pisonarum Illustribus, which was written in Pisa in Italy, and it describes how Catalans together with Occitans actually captured Majorca from the Muslim Taifa that was there at the time. Although fairly soon after, in 1137, we hear about the Count of Barcelona marrying into the Crown of Aragon, just bringing these groups together. The Counts of Barcelona had become the most powerful of these marcher lords and had extended their territory at the cost of other marcher lords and the Muslim taifas in the region. And this is really the birth of what we would call the Principality of Catalonia, which was part of the Crown of Aragon. In 1164, we hear about it as its own legal system for the first time, as its own legal entity. It retained its own political structure as well as judicial system that was separate from the rest of the Kingdom of Aragon. In 1469, the two most powerful kingdoms in Spain at the time, the Muslims largely having been confined to the very south, were the Kingdom of Aragon, of which Catalunya was part, and the Kingdom of Castile, which had actually been sort of a kind of vassal kingdom of the Kingdom of Leon, but had then incorporated Leon itself when it became the more powerful of the two. And so now Castile and Aragon became unified in 1469 with the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella, and these monarchs, known as the Catholic monarchs in Spain, were really where the idea of a modern Spain started, with the union of these old medieval kingdoms into a composite monarchy where each of the old kingdoms retained a certain degree of autonomy, as can still be seen on the modern Spanish coat of arms with the old banners of the kingdoms presented there. This meant that for a time the separate institutions and customs of Catalonia were respected as part of the Kingdom of Aragon inside the larger umbrella of the composite monarchy of Spain. But this wasn't to last. During the Franco-Spanish War between the Habsburg Spanish and the French, the Spanish had to post a lot of troops to the border with France, which was in the Pyrenees, which was the area of Catalonia. And the stationing of these troops brought a lot of tension to the region, as hosting any early modern army would, with the amount of looting that would go on, the food resources needed, the billeting of garrisons, and of course the tendencies of the soldiers to steal things and also to commit acts of violence and sexual violence against the local population. This led in 1640 to the outbreak of the Reapers' War, in which the local Catalan population rose up against the Spanish, and after having killed several important officials in the following year, 1641, they declared the independent República Catalana. And in doing so, they did actually create an independent Catalan state, although one could argue this wasn't because of any kind of separatist fervour, but rather as a protest to all the Castilian soldiers that were being stationed in their home region. What makes this even more interesting is that they actually made Louis XVIII of France the Count of Barcelona, because of course the Spanish were fighting against the French at the time, and so they sought French protection and help. So essentially they then put the King of France as the leader of the old Principality of Catalonia by making him the Count of Barcelona, which brought French protection. So you could in fact argue that this independent Catalonia was only around for a very short amount of time before French protection came there. But on the other hand, you could say that, well, they needed the French protection against the Spanish. And with this French protection, they were able to defeat the Spanish at the Battle at Montjuic, and because of this, they held on to their independence. But this ended in 1652 with the end of hostilities between France and Spain, and so Catalonia went back to Spain. That is, apart from one area in the north of Catalonia, the area of Roussillon, and this became part of France. And still today, this is a region of France where 34% of the population speak Catalan. And that's why in the start of the video I said that Catalonia is largely in the northeast of Spain, as there is also a part across the border in France. Another fun bit of trivia about the Reapers' War is that it gave its name to the Catalan national anthem, Els Segadors, which means the Reapers, because this was the farming implement that was turned into weapons by the local population to fight against the Spanish during this conflict. But of course, at the end of the Reapers' War in 1652, the region was reincorporated back into Habsburg Spain after a brief stint of independence, but it is nonetheless a brief stint of independence, depending on how you see it, of course. After this, they were able to bounce back because they were a wine-producing region, and at the time, there was one nation in Europe that really liked a borreltje, and that, of course, was the Dutch Republic. This period of prosperity was not to last, however, as in 1700 the Spanish King Charles II died, and there was a bit of a crisis at his succession. Philip V was the natural one to succeed, but he was a member of the House of Bourbon, and this was a French ruling house. Now, while he was supported by both the Spanish and the French, this would in essence create a Franco-Spanish megastate that would be incredibly powerful in Europe, and was something that a coalition of the Dutch Republic, Great Britain and the Holy Roman Empire did not want to see. They instead proposed that the rightful ruler should be Charles VI, who was also the Archduke at the time of Austria. But this was not acceptable to the French and the Spanish, and this in turn led to the War of Spanish Succession. The area of Catalonia, of course, was part of Habsburg Spain and initially also backed Philip V as the ruler. But in 1706, when Archduke Charles entered the region of Catalonia, they switched sides and instead backed him. Now, this proved to be a disastrous move because Philip succeeded in becoming the new ruler of Spain, but also gave up the throne of France, essentially also making the Allies happy at the conclusion of the war. Now, while other territories that were Spanish but had backed the Austrian side or had been taken over to them became Austrian, for example, the Spanish Netherlands became the Austrian Netherlands for this reason, Catalonia remained part of Spain, and now they were the part of Spain that had broken their oath to the Spanish king and to now the new ruler of Spain, Philip V, by backing his opponent, and so Philip V set out to punish Catalonia for its treachery. This came about in around 1714 with a decree called the Decretos de Nueva Planta, which essentially did many things to bring Spain together more as a centralized nation, basically abolishing the special privileges and laws of other areas and bringing them under Castilian law. If you're interested in this period, I talked a little bit about it in my video on the Spanish flag and how it changed, as it's around this time that the flag also changed, and the things it represents on the flag are symbolic of the changes occurring in the country at the time. Now, this also made Castilian the only official language of the kingdom, and so in a Catalan context it banned Catalan from being used in court cases and in other areas, as well as marginalizing the very successful universities of the region and actually bringing some out of the city of Barcelona and bringing them to other areas of the kingdom to lessen the effect and the intellectual hub that had been around in Catalunya. Now, his successor Charles III went even further and banned the use of Catalan in any legal administrative areas, as well as in education, which sent the language into a downward spiral. Now, in 1795, of course, there was a war fought against the French, who had just revolted against the king and become a republic, and while the area was also occupied by Napoleonic forces, there was no real Catalan move to capitalize on this and to become an independent nation. And actually there were many guerrillas fighting against the French in Catalunya, just as in other parts of Spain. The 19th century in Catalonia saw increasing industrialization, which would have several important implications for the future of Catalan national identity. One was that many new workers would arrive from various areas who of course were not Catalan speaking but Spanish speaking, but also the fact that with industrialization came poor worker conditions, and this would then lead to more republicanism growing in large areas as well as the development of a more bourgeois class in Catalonia. Now in 1833, another war hit the area called the First Carlist War, in which the Infante Carlos tried to gain power from the ruling monarch Isabella instead, and this actually split the Catalan region, with many of the areas of the more bourgeois and industrialized areas supporting the liberals who were fighting for Isabella, while in the rural areas some Catalans also fought on the side of the Carlists, because they hoped that bringing back the old regime might help to restore the older privileges that the region had had in terms of their own laws and their own languages. But ultimately the Carlists were defeated. They try again in 1846 in the Second Carlist War, and actually some historians have viewed this war as being primarily a Catalan revolt against the central organization in Madrid, as many of the Catalans became very dissatisfied with the corruption of the liberal government that had come in place under Isabella, but it was once again crushed by the regime. Going further into the 19th century, in 1873, of course, this would see the first actual republic, and of course Catalan republicanism was very important in the establishment of the first Spanish Republic. An important development in this time is the idea that the Catalan Republicans were trying to create a more federalized republican Spain from within the entity itself, rather than breaking away and being an independent country, as I think to the people at the time what mattered more was getting these privileges for their language, and in terms of having their own courts that could cater to their own culture, rather than necessarily being a completely independent nation, as some have claimed for the time period and for later on. Now, this first Spanish Republic didn't last very long, and in 1874 it was already driven into the ground by another coup. But during this time, the Catalan idea of Catalanism, or the importance of a Catalan people, was bounding around in the higher classes of the bourgeois and further up in society as well, which was very important. But as I said, that actually around this time and up into the early 20th century, it's more the ideals of republicanism that were important, rather than sort of separation from Spain as an independent Catalan state, although this also did exist, but more as a fringe idea. In 1898, for example, when several regions like Cuba and Puerto Rico did become independent from Spain, this did give a boon to several Catalan nationalists, and there is indeed a reason that the Catalan Astelara flag does look very similar to that of Puerto Rico and of Cuba. The upper class intellectuals of Catalonia also wanted to promote Catalan literature, history, and its language in various forms, but this not largely remained an upper class pursuit, as for the lower classes there were three bands of socialism, anarchism, and syndicalism that remained the most important social streams, rather than necessarily identifying with this cultural stream of Catalan nationalism, although this would also slowly start to change. In 1910, this disparity was highlighted in what would become known as the Tragic Week, in which the Spanish army called up for more reserves from the region, but the strongly left-wing area of Barcelona and the surrounding area in Catalonia refused, leading to violence between the police and army and various protesters. However, in 1913, Catalonia was able to unify the four provinces it had been divided into an actual commonwealth. 1922 even saw the creation of the first pro-independence Catalan nationalist party, the Estat Català, which called for a complete secession from Spain, although it would for the largest part remain a minority. In 1923, the more pro-Catalanist parties would become more left-wing, and this is because in this year Miguel Primero de Rivera became the new autocratic leader thanks to a coup d'etat in Spain, and he was initially supported by the more right-wing conservative Catalanist parties. And because of this, actually, the Catalanist movement moved to the left as he actually cracked down on the freedoms that people had, and so they became more ostracized in the community. In 1926, in one of the more interesting occurrences in the early 20th century, an army was meant to arrive from Catalonia into the Roussillon region that I discussed earlier in the video, that part of France, and take it over as part of a new Catalan homeland, but the French police got wind of the idea and it never went ahead, although that could have been potentially very interesting. Primo de Rivera would be overthrown in 1930, and a year later the Second Spanish Republic would be declared, of which Catalonia played an important part, again because they were hoping to influence the rule of the country and create a more federalized state, and indeed seem to have done so very successfully, as the constitution granted a lot of power to Catalonia and to other independentist regions of Spain like the Basque country. Now, in 1934, however, they did actually try to secede away from Spain, or that is part of the more radical independentist movement in Catalonia, although this independent Catalonia lasted for a total of 10 hours before it was reincorporated into the Second Spanish Republic. So I suppose you could say, yes, that is evidence that Catalonia was independent for a while, but it was 10 hours, which is about half the time it took me to make this video. In 1936, of course, this would all change with the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War. I've got plenty of videos about that if you're interested in finding out about that in more detail. But, of course, the Spanish Civil War started off as an attempted coup, a revolt of the army in all the major cities of Spain, although the army revolt was unsuccessful in Barcelona, probably because of the amount of unionized and armed workers and syndicalists that had been there since the late 19th century. And so Barcelona became a very important city in the Republic. They would have many troubles during the war, of course. It would be bombed by the Italian Air Force, interestingly enough, and also they would have their own civil war within a civil war, fighting against various anarchist and syndicalist groups during 1937. This infighting, of course, further weakened the Republican cause, and it's true that by 1938, Barcelona and the region of Catalonia was captured by nationalist forces who would go on to win the war the year later. This, of course, greatly diminished the autonomy of Catalonia, and the dictatorship of Franco did not take lightly to a region that had rebelled against his authority, and so the Catalan language as well was banned from being spoken and became relegated to the home, as well as around 4,000 people being killed from the end of the Spanish Civil War up until around 1950 from Catalunya. In 1959, the fascist system decided to shake things up with economic restructuring, and this led to many factory workers from the south of Spain, especially from Andalucía and Extremadura, and also from the north in Galicia, moved to the industrial region of Catalonia, which brought many non-Catalan speakers with a different identity to the region. And this again is some of the explanation as to why the rural areas are less likely to be in favor of secession from Spain and are more likely to be pro-union, while slightly higher class, as we already saw in the 19th century, the sort of more middle classes and upper classes are more likely to be in favor of independence, probably because a lot of these lower class people also weren't from Catalonia originally, but came there during this period. Now, in 1975, Franco died, and there was a transition back to democracy into the system of the Spanish government that we have today. And this led to a lot more autonomy for Catalonia, but this also was the birth of the modern independence movement of Catalonia at the time, although initially they sought just to get more autonomy within Spain. In the new constitution, it saw Catalonia as being a nationality, but later on the wording of this would be changed. Of course, the ban on the Catalan language was lifted, and it can now be used in regional television and film, as well as on legal documents and in the courts inside Catalonia. In the 1990s, they became especially important as autonomy parties were getting more votes because the Spanish parliament was hung without having a majority on either side. So these somewhat smaller regional nationalist parties like the Catalan, Basque and from the Canary Islands became incredibly important for these governments to form majorities, and so they managed to get more concessions from the Spanish government on their own regional autonomy. This eventually paved the way for, in 2006, the new consideration of the Estat d'Autonomia de Catalunya, which would grant Catalunya yet further autonomy and rights in a move towards what some hoped would become total independence from Spain. However, this was put to a vote and it found that 74% were in favour of this. However, it turned out that voter turnout was only around 49%, and so this led the Spanish PP party, which stands for the Partido Popular, to complain and to say that this, wasn't quite constitutional and that the Spanish Constitutional Court should intervene, which they did in 2010 when they rewrote several of the laws before it was passed in 2012. But this caused outrage for the Catalan people because this was no longer the document that their government had put together for more autonomy, which they found in this election that most people who had voted, at least, had wanted to see put through. The slogan of the protest becoming Som una nació, nosaltres decidem, meaning we are a nation, we decide. But this didn't happen, and in 2015 the increasing number of votes gotten by these pro-independence parties decided to hold another election, a binding in-out referendum on Catalonian independence from Spain, and this was held in 2017, and they found that 92% of those who voted were in favour of Catalonia becoming an independent country completely autonomous from Spain. However, the Spanish government had, before the vote, said that it was unconstitutional. According to the Spanish constitution, you may not vote to leave Spain. That is indeed sedition, and had said that the vote was illegal and tried to shut down the vote in its entirety by sending in the Guardia Civil, Spain's national police force, to stop people from voting. However, a large part of the vote and the polling stations did indeed take place because the Mossos de Esquadra, which is the Catalan regional police, actually stood by and let the people vote instead of blocking them like the Guardia Civil did, and that's where we saw all the very violent images of the Guardia Civil and the protesters who were trying to vote in this election fighting against one another, because the Catalan government had said that it was a legal election, while the national Spanish government had said that this was an illegal vote and that it therefore should not take place. Because not everyone was able to reach the polling stations, this also impacted the vote, as well as the fact, of course, that the Spanish government, who Spanish unionists, those who want to stay with Spain, likely will have listened to, had declared the vote illegal. So it's likely that this vote is not actually an accurate representation of what the entire population of Catalonia believes. Even so, the pro-independence parties, the government of Catalonia at the time, said that 92% had voted in favour, and that actually they think that about 55% of the Catalan population had voted. But of course, with all the violence and the legal turmoil surrounding the vote, it's impossible to know whether these figures are actually accurate. And of course, the Spanish government had already said that this was an unconstitutional and therefore not legally binding vote. Nevertheless, the leader of the Catalan government at the time, Carles Puigdemont, which is not the right way to spell that, that's better, did declare that Catalonia was now an independent state, although Spain moved to impose direct rule over it, and he and several members of his government fled to the European Parliament, which they would later be elected to by the Catalans who supported them. But of course that meant that Catalonia did not become an independent nation in 2017, despite what its government had announced. Now let's go back to Pablo Hastél and his recent arrest and how this plays into the entire story. In 2011, he was convicted because he had praised several groups in his lyrics. He'd said Camarada Arenas, and this figure had been arrested as the leader of a group called GRAPO, which was this communist group that had launched several terrorist attacks against the Spanish government, largely in the 70s and 80s, but also continuing on today. 2014, he was also found guilty for various tweets and other lyrics about the Spanish monarchy. And this is the real issue with the free speech that comes in here, because he called the monarchy an awful lot of different things, but they are given these special privileges that other people aren't in terms of what you can and can't say about them. And of course, as we have seen, Catalonia was, since the 19th century and even earlier, a bastion of republicanism, of having this special identity and being somewhat separate to the rest of Spain in terms of their legal system, their language, their judiciary, etc. So that's how this really plays into that. There's also the fact that this year in 2021, he barricaded himself in the university and was then subsequently arrested. Now the fact is that Pablo Hastél is himself Catalan, and that's why he gets a lot of support from the region, but he's not the only Catalan rapper to have been targeted for free speech and imprisoned, and these are the first artists to be imprisoned for their lyrics since the Franco dictatorship, which was famous for cracking down on poets and other artists for their lyrics if they were against the regime. This also happened to another individual, José Miguel Arenas Beltrán, who also comes from Catalonia. And so this is very interesting development that they feel they are being targeted unfairly by the Spanish government, while others say that their praising of terrorist groups that have killed hundreds of people, as well as insulting the crown of Spain, is against the constitution and therefore illegal. But this also creates the problem of if there are those in the country that disagree with the constitution and therefore think they should be independent, then they are bound by the constitution not to insult it, which makes a difficult situation and is something that has been brought up in this free speech debate. These protests against their arrest coincides with the earlier elections this month in the region of Catalonia, which saw actually great increases for pro-independence parties at the loss of the Ciudadanos party, which was completely against independence and actually is basically the party for the Catalan unionists who wish to stay with Spain. It also saw a rise in votes for the far-right Vox party in Spain, as well as PSOE gaining more votes, which is the Spanish Socialist Party that is currently ruling in Spain at the moment. Now, what's interesting is that Ciudadanos had said that they would never work together with the pro-independence parties. However, PSOE, which has done well in the region and is currently the ruling government in Spain, has said that they would consider working together and discussing future autonomy and possibly independence, although we shall see if that comes about with these pro-independence Catalan parties, which makes the prospects of further demonstrations and clamour for independence in the region seem a lot more likely. Although from the Spanish side, this is a really difficult issue because Spain, as you can see on its very flag, is made up of all of these old kingdoms that were once independent. And ultimately, this is why it is illegal in the Spanish constitution for a region to push and essentially to hold a referendum on independence. It's also a bit of a matter for the Spanish of letting the cat out of the box. If you do it once, then it's more likely to happen again. So if they do concede to Catalan independence, even if the majority of the population do indeed vote for this, this will then also imply that they may be willing to do so again, given that they apply enough pressure for other regions with strong identities and independence movements. Of course, we think here of the Basque region, the Canary Islands and Galicia, all of which have had pro-independence movements, as well as various armed militant groups, terrorist groups like the ETA, which I discussed earlier in the video, that have pushed for independence. And it's possible that if Catalonia becomes independent, that then these groups will be reinvigorated, which could potentially lead to a breakup of Spain, as there are so many identities within it, as well as a resurgence in violence in these areas. Now, these are the most prominent, but of course there are also other areas with strong identities like Asturias, Andalucía and Valencia, all of which also have pro-independence movements, although they aren't as large as these aforementioned regions. But it's a lot for the Spanish government to consider, and it's quite possible that if Catalonia does become independent, it wouldn't just stop with Catalonia, and that would create a big problem for Spain, as well as the fact that Catalonia is one of the wealthiest areas and what was the most industrialized areas, as well as the most learned areas, with many universities and lots of tourism going there too. So there's a lot at stake in this debate. But I think that is where I'm going to leave it today, because this is going to be a really long video. I spent a long time working on this, and I hope it's an improvement from the one I made a few years ago, as I really did want to make something that was a little more balanced and looked at a few more angles as well. Do let me know what you think of this in the description below, whether you'd include any other points in this debate, and also what your opinions are, because I'm very pleased to see people sharing their opinions in the chat. I do ask that you are respectful to people who have a different opinion to yours, and that you maybe try and learn something from them, as I think that's the best way to go into this kind of discussion. But please do let me know what you thought in the comments below about this video, and share it if you would. That would really help out my channel. So anyway, I have been Hilbert. Next week on Friday I will have another video for you looking at some current events, and this has been The History. Also, a really massive thank you to my friend Sandy for helping me out with the Catalan pronunciation. Really appreciate that.